I'm Grandmaster Ron W Henley here for ICC, and in this series of videos we're going to look at Rook endgames, tactics and themes. We're going to break the Rook endgame study up into three different series of videos. The first, tactics and themes. The second will cover strategic concepts, and then the third will be practical play, which will see world champions, some of the best players in the world, grandmasters, and see how they make extra half points and sometimes lose extra half points in the endgames. So, why Rook endgames? Turns out that statistically speaking, 50% of almost all endgames in tournament practice are Rook and Pawn endgames. That is, both sides have some combination of rooks and pawns. And this is according to I.M. Nikolai Minov, who wrote an excellent practical guide to Rook endgames in 2004. So let's take a look why he's talking about this. If you think about the initial setup position, the rooks start out in the corners. Okay? In the early stages, the white player plays a move like e4, and the pieces start to come out and come into conflict. The rooks are the last pieces to get developed, and as a result, usually survive the opening and the middle game, and thus, that's why 50% of most endgames in tournament practice are actually Rook endings. Now, of course, what is the goal in the endgame? Well, of course, the goal in any game, chess game, is to checkmate, but specifically in the endgame, usually the goal is pawn promotion, followed by winning a large amount of enemy material or simply getting a queen and tracking the enemy king down. Pawn promotion is a chess rule whereby a pawn that reaches its 8th rank is immediately changed into a player's choice of queen, rook, bishop, or knight. The new piece replaces the pawn on the same square, and the whole process is considered to be a single move. Since the queen is the most valuable piece, it is the usual choice once a pawn is promoted. However, the primary goal of almost every endgame is the promotion of a passed pawn, as achieving this will represent a substantial gain in material which presumably can then be used to overpower the opposing forces and ultimately deliver checkmate. Pawn promotion, or the threat of it, often decides the results of an endgame in chess. This is one of the more basic concepts. I like to call this check and queen. Check and queen is a basic but powerful Rook endgame technique when a rook is placed in front of its own passed pawn. The idea is that the rook moves away, administers check to the enemy king, thus vacating the quote queen square, and this gains a vital tempo to promote the push of the passed pawn to the 8th rank and promotion. You can see the white pawn is going forward, would like to go one more step and promote. However, it is blocked in by its own rook, and the black rook is very well placed behind the enemy passed pawn. But white, due to the poor placement of the black king, is able to check. When the king moves, white simply promotes his pawn, gets a new queen, and this will win sufficient material for white to win the game. Very important motif. We call that check and queen. Okay, the checking distance is a defensive technique where the defending rook harasses the enemy king from long range with a barrage of checks. To have a chance of being successful, the attacking rook has to be sufficiently far away so the enemy king is unable to approach and attack the rook. Let's look at an example. In a rook ending where the defending rook is on the 8th rank and the king is trying to advance his passed pawn, such as the position we see here, the defending rook at this point has sufficient checking distance to keep the king from progressing. For example, we can see if the white king tries to come forward, incidentally threaten a little checkmate, the black rook simply checks. When the white king tries to come up the board, he is not able to really make progress because once he gets to this critical moment, the rook is able to check, and if the king continues forward, the pawn behind is in danger. White has nothing better than to go back to the starting position. And we can see he's unable to make progress after black simply repeats. The other key thing to note about this position is that the black king is cut off. Since a rook is able to move an unlimited number of empty squares vertically, it can create what I call an invisible electric fence and cut off the enemy king along a file to prevent him from approaching a passed pawn. In a rook ending, the file cut is a very powerful weapon that prevents the enemy king from crossing a file without assistance.